Join us for this special episode recorded before a live audience here in Temple Drottnmiller Airport. Coming up. September the 18th, 2021, and for the first time in 21 months, we, as the community of aviators, meet in person for Breaking the Chain. What is Breaking the Chain? Breaking the Chain is a series based on the whole chain of events that occurs from the moment an idea pops in one's mind to a situation occurring. Could be a good situation or a bad situation. In this respect, we talk about it from the standpoint of a bad situation. That's what this program is derived around. 4 years ago this month, I was giving a flight review and having lunch over at Cooper's in Lanville, Texas, having a discussion with my student. We talked about the air chain of events that leads to an accident. There are always several links of the chain that leads us to an incident or an accident to occur. That chain of events can also be applied to other aspects of our life. Now, we had this wonderful discussion over brisket, and Shane, I'm going to throw him under the bus. He's not here today, unfortunately. Shane said, why don't we get a group of pilots together and have conversations just like this? Well, the idea became fruition. 3 months later, we started having group settings and meetings throughout Central Texas, and it was an instant hit. We've had guest speakers come and present in person, and in January 2020, I had this fine gentleman, Mr. Brian Lloyd, be my guest speaker in San Marcos, and we had the FAA come participate. They said it was an outstanding, wonderful presentation and event. You need to keep doing this, keep pressing on. And we brought the Wings program on board with Breaking the Chain, so it really escalated to something bigger throughout Central Texas. And then, March came along, and I had decided to get another guest speaker to come present, Ken Wittekiend. And this was March 2020. And he was going to bring his discussion called What Were They Thinking?, which is what we're going to talk about today. What happened in March 2020? Lockdown. Everything went crazy. The world shut down. So a couple of my camaraderies, some are here, Paul is somewhere in the audience, said, hey, why don't you consider bringing your program to Zoom? And I said, I don't know anything about Zoom. Why don't you help me out? So him and Ken Viard and some others said, do it. Let's try it. So we tried a trial run in early April, March timeframe of 2020, and I hosted that first event, and it was an immediate success. And due to popular demand, we started doing them every 2 weeks. We've hosted over 35 webinars now. The footprint has expanded from that lunch in Lanville, Texas, to the far reaches of the Philippines, New Zealand. I've spoken with folks in Great Britain who participate in this particular webinar series. It's amazing, and I'm greatly proud to be a part of something that you as the community of aviators have helped support and push along. I could not do this without the support of my family. That's my airplane, Betsy Blue, which is parked over in Hangar 27 in the T hangars right over there, and I'll be happy to show it off after the presentation. My wife Talia and our 5 kids. I'm an airline transport pilot, flew helicopters in the Army, Apache Longbows. I'm checked out in seaplanes, gliders, gyroplanes. I've got 5 type ratings in various jets in the King Air, and been in aviation for 25 years. I'm a major in the United States Army Reserve, and I'm an aviation content creator. I really enjoy it. Our guest speaker today, Ken Wittekiend. Ken is a professional aviation educator and founder of ProMark Aviation. He's also a columnist for Plane and Pilot, where he does a column called The Wandering Skies. He's given over 2,500 check rides as a designated pilot examiner, former designated pilot examiner, to be more specific. He was the 2009 and 2015 FAA CFI of the Southwest region. And he is an avid adventure seeker, likes to fly all over the hill country of Texas and as far as Alaska in float planes. He specializes in float plane training, which he taught me, tailwheel training, and Beechcraft Bonanza training. Besides corralling myself and Trace Clinton, he also enjoys to have a sip of cranberry juice from time to time. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce our guest speaker, Ken Wittekiend. Ken, you have the flight control.
I've got the flight controller. Thanks, Jeremy. And before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to thank several other people who helped put this together. First, Corey Rance. Corey, where are you? I don't know. He left. Anyway, Corey provided the hangar and the food and a lot of the logistical support to make this happen. So we very much appreciate that. A couple others that are here. Marissa Beckett has been instrumental in all of the efforts that have followed on to the recent unpleasantness that happened about a year ago. Along with Chris and with Trace and with Jeremy, it's been rewarding because of the outpouring of support, and she spearheaded an awful lot of that. So very much appreciate you being here today, Marissa. All of you are family. All of you are friends, some of whom I haven't met yet, but you're friends nevertheless. And so we'll get to know each other as we go through today. Andrew Stagg is here. Andrew's a dear friend, now a commercial airline pilot and a Canadian. Don't hold that against him. He's working on fixing that problem. Chris McCrank is here. Chris is a dear friend, joined me in Alaska last summer as we had the float plane up there and had a marvelous adventure. So it's good to see everybody here. So today we're going to talk about what I find to be a really interesting subject. But to get started on this, you and I are going to do some exploring together. Anybody recognize Greg Norman? Greg Norman is called the Great White Shark. He has finished in the top 10 in 29 professional golf tournaments. He's been number 1 in the world for 330 weeks. Clearly at the top of the golf game. Yet in the 1996 Masters, he goes into the final round leading Nick Faldo by 6 strokes. An insurmountable lead in golf. And by the end of that round, he had collapsed and lost the tournament by 5 strokes. And all he and Nick could do was fall in each other's arms and cry at this amazing collapse, this choke that occurred, which today is one of the greatest debacles in sports history. James Gabba, 36-year-old combat veteran, Army Ranger, back from a combat deployment, is on a rafting trip on the Gauley River in West Virginia. Beautiful day, the river's not particularly rough or difficult. They're going down a set of rapids, and he gets bounced out of the raft along with the guide. And the guide swims over to Gabba to help him get to shore. Gabba laughs at him, pushes him away. He's having the time of his life. He's on vacation. The water feels great. Gaba is swept on down the river behind a rock, trapped by the hydraulic, pinned and drowns. A Navy flight crew is doing night qualifications off the coast of Virginia. Calm seas, light winds, clear skies, no problem. The pilot comes around for the landing, gets low in the approach and gets slow. And as he's approaching the boat, the LSO turns on the go-around lights and starts screaming at him over the radio to go around. The pilot doesn't react to that, slams the jet into the roundout on the back of the carrier, breaks the jet in half and kills his back seater. On the day after 9/11, an airline flight coming out of JFK, commercial pilot has an encounter with a routine weight turbulence from another airplane. Happens a lot in commercial aviation, no big deal. Yet this pilot over controls the airplane until he breaks the tail of the airplane off, kills 260 on the airplane and several on the ground. So if you think about it, it happens not just to pilots. It happens to sailors, it happens to surgeons, it happens even to business executives. Everybody knows of people who have done similar strange things. And despite all the emphasis on aeronautical risk management and aeronautical decision making and risk management, we still think it won't happen to us. We read the accident reports, don't we? And we think, I'd never do that. How could anybody be that dumb? And so it's sort of a mystery. We think it'll be the other guy who crashes and who lands his airplane gear up, who runs out of gas, or who gets lost, or who lands short of the runway, or who has an engine failure on takeoff and turns back and crashes the airplane. We think we're too cool for that. We won't be the guy that does that. But then one day we find ourselves in an unfamiliar situation where we struggle to cope and we start to panic a little bit. And most of the time it works out. And we have a great story for the bar that night. But not always. Sometimes it goes wrong. And our friends and families are left wondering, what was he thinking? How did something like that happen to somebody who had the experience and the knowledge and the skill, and yet they couldn't overcome the situation they found themselves in? So that was the premise. And again, most of us think it won't be us that it happens to, but when we look at the statistics, about 65% of GA accidents are due to human error. Think about that, 65%. And when we drill down a little bit, it's about 80% of the time it's a failure of skill, about 30% it's a poor decision, and about 6% is we just don't see what we need to see. So I got to wondering, why does stuff like this happen? And I was reading a book a couple of years ago by a guy named Larry Gonzalez, who wrote Deep Survival, talking about how people survive encounters like this. And he then went on to write another book called Everyday Survival. And he opened my eyes. He began to explain some of these inexplicable things that seem to occur to these people. And the more I read, the more I thought, well, there are lessons here for all of us, not just for pilots, but for adventurers and climbers and sailors and ordinary folks in extraordinary circumstances, anyone who finds himself in a high-risk environment. And certainly aviators operate in a high-risk environment. So Larry explains that we start out with something called a mental model that happen from inputs, things that we interact with our environment. And our brain begins to say, okay, well, I recognize this. I've been in a circumstance like this before. I understand the reality. And when we start out learning anything, any of you that have learned something new recently, or anybody that can remember when they were learning to fly, anytime we learn something new, it starts out as explicit learning. We have to stop and think about it. Think about tying your shoes for the first time. And you have to stop and think, well, how do I do that? Or tying a tie. Anybody ever tried to tie for somebody else? It doesn't work very well, does it? That's because for you, it's implicit. You just know how to do it. But when you have to stop and think about it, all of a sudden it becomes a lot harder. And when we get stressed, it becomes harder still, and it can disrupt everything. Anybody remember their first introduction to power off stalls? Yeah, it was hard. It was difficult. It was scary. It didn't make sense that we had to reduce the pitch of the airplane to fix this problem. That was counterintuitive. We could do it with some coaching and thinking about it, but with practice, it became automatic. We then hopefully learned that that's the right way to fix the problem. So once we do this, then we end up creating what's called a behavioral script. This is a little bit of code in our brain that runs in the background, like brushing your teeth. You can be thinking about the flight you're going to make tomorrow while you're brushing your teeth. You don't have to think about the process because there's a script that runs. And it's automating simple tasks. Driving a car is that way. If you can, in fact, part of the problem with distracted driving is it has become so automatic for people that they think they have plenty of brain bandwidth to do other things. And in reality, that's not always true. And this is all run by the emotional part of our system. And if you think about it, you know, you've heard the expression fight or flight, or think about if you're hiking and all of a sudden there's something on the ground that you perceive might be a snake. There's an automatic script that runs to make you jump from that. And all of that works, and it's really good as long as it doesn't get interrupted. But if the reaction is wrong, or the script is incorrect, or something has changed in the environment, it can create some real problems. How about this one? Anybody, you can't see that very well, but anybody had their pre-flight interrupted and forgot to untie something on the airplane? Yeah, that's the kind of thing. This script of pre-flighting the airplane runs in the background. We just do it. We know how to do it. But if somebody comes up to us and interrupts us, it's real easy to get distracted and then forget something important. Happens a lot. Let me give you another example. This is a lady named Lynn Hill. Lynn is a very well-known climber. She has won 30 alpine climbing titles. And she's climbing in France on this day on a relatively easy route. And she's standing there getting ready to climb, and she's putting on her harness, and she's threading the rope through the harness. And somebody walks up to visit with her. So she stops what she's doing, and she finishes her conversation, and she thinks, oh, I need to tie my shoe. So she reaches down, she ties her shoe, and she goes ahead with the climb. She climbs up, finishes the climb, and decides to rappel back to the ground. And when Lynn leaned back to rappel down, the rope came out of her harness because she had never tied it. She fell 72 feet into some trees and barely survived. So again, this is run by our emotions, and when we look at that, we know they're fast. You know, this is a fight or flight. They're very strong. They are hardwired. They just run quickly. They result from past experience, things that we've had happen that taught us about how to react to that. And they're quick. They happen so quickly, they're really good for decision making, but we got to recognize that sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they don't fit. And they can overwhelm our ability to recognize something has changed. So if we can't depend on emotion to solve the problem, maybe we can think our way through it. But we have to have first the proper knowledge that fits the circumstances that we're in. We have to be paying attention. That's the other thing that's part of this. So we notice when things have changed. But it doesn't work well when a sudden event or a problem occurs. If something happens unexpectedly, we don't really have time to stop and think about, oh my gosh, this is just going on. We have to generally depend on this automatic response, at least in the beginning. And it's even worse if we're scared or stressed. So part of this, remember I said perception was sometimes 6% of the problem. What about this? Everybody believe that to be true? I'll give you an example. If there's an accident between a vehicle, an automobile, and a motorcycle, and the cop comes out and he's interviewing the driver of the car, what does the driver always say? I never saw that motorcycle. Well, they probably registered it visually, but it just didn't make enough to raise awareness to where they knew there was a motorcycle there. And so we fail to see the unexpected, just like with the motorcycle. The same thing happens in flying. Mid-air collisions happen that way. We don't expect there to be another airplane. Runway incursions happen that way. We don't expect there to be another airplane on the runway, but it happens. And when the more stressed we are, the more difficult this can be. Anybody ever missed a radio call going into Addison? Sure, we get busy and the radio gets busy and we're focused or busy or stressed with something. It's real easy to miss those calls. That's another example of this. The Navy pilot landing on that carrier, certainly visually, his eyes saw that red light come on. His ears probably heard something, but it couldn't get through the noise of all of the stress that he was operating under. And if something doesn't fit, we just tend to ignore it. We just tend to either ignore it or, well, let me ask this. Anybody ever been lost in an airplane? Oh, come on. What do we do if we're looking for the next checkpoint and it doesn't show up? We say, oh, well, that water tower is probably in the wrong place. It probably really is the right. That's Pflugerville. I know it is. All right. And then, like I say, stress causes tunnel vision. We don't perform very well when we're under stress. So let's back up just a step here and let's look at this. Think about this explicit learning and how babies learn. Babies cry for attention. Anybody got kids or young kids or grandkids? All right, mamas can learn very quickly to distinguish between a cry where the baby is really uncomfortable or really having a problem and when they're just crying for attention. They become totally dialed into all that. And the babies learn to cry for attention. They also learn that there's a risk in getting up from crawling and starting to walk. They're going to fall and they're going to bang themselves, but it's worth it. For the increased mobility that they get from walking, they're willing to accept the risk of falling down. So they learn and they adapt. Give you an aviation example. First flight with a non-aviator. It is really important for you to give them a good experience because they are forming this mental model of what flying with Sasser in a carbon cub is like. And if he gives them a good ride, they're going to want to go again. If he doesn't, they're going to say, I knew this was a bad idea. I don't want to do that again. Anybody ever done this? I don't know if you can see it. That's a snowboarder. Anybody snowboard in here? I tried it one time. Let me tell you, you hang an edge and you get an instant education in why you don't want to do that. So you learn implicitly to keep that edge up so that doesn't happen again. That's another example of this script that gets running. And with practice, it gets easier, doesn't it? And pretty soon we can just do it. We don't think about it. In fact, if we think about it, it gets worse again. And this is true about a lot of this stuff. Greg Norman, the golfer, certainly had the skill and the knowledge and the experience. He played in major tournaments for his whole career. Yet on that day at the Masters, he started thinking about the problems he was having, and it just collapsed. Somebody once said, panic is not thinking enough, choking is thinking too much. And that may be true. His brain got in the way that day. So, if you think about it, part of the reason why children learn as quickly and as much as they do is they're curious about everything. And part of the solution to what we're talking about today is this idea of maintaining this sense of curiosity about things. If we lose it and we become narrowly focused on what we're doing, on the minutia, as it were, then when something happens that's outside that experience, we're oblivious to it. We're not paying enough attention. I gave you a story about a lack of curiosity. I left one morning from Burnett to fly down to San Marcos to do flight tests for a school down there, and the weather was very benign IMC, about 800 overcast, good visibility underneath. It's only about a 50-mile flight, nothing to it. I had done it 20 times. So I filed IFR, took off, got my clearance, climbed up above the overcast, and get handed off to Austin, And they said, let me know when you've got the San Marcos weather. So I punch up the ATIS and it says 300 overcast, 1 mile in fog. And I go, what? Now all of a sudden I was hit by something I was completely not expecting. I had a mental model of what this day was going to be like. I was going to go down there and shoot an approach to 800 feet, break out, good visibility, land, go on about my business. And all of a sudden, it's not that way. And they were not using the approach I expected. I had to change approaches. I had to kind of get mentally caught up with what was going on. And I get turned on to final, and I scramble and don't do a very good job, but I finally get the thing set, and I'm coming down, and the tower caller says, will you give me a base report? And I said, okay. So I come down through 300 feet and keep descending. Nothing in sight. And I am not prepared to go around here, folks. I haven't thought about the go-around procedure or anything. I'm thinking I'm landing, right? So I come on down at about 200 feet. I could see the first part of the runway and the lead-in lights, and landed, taxied off the runway, and watched the tower cab go in the clouds as the clouds came down. Things had changed, and it caught me completely unaware. So, part of this then says, well, maybe we can think about how we deal with that in terms of decision making. It's supposed to be a rational process, but maybe it is and maybe not so much. The first thing that happens in making a decision, we have to perceive that something has changed. And we have to realize usually those decisions are part of these emotional bookmarks that we've been talking about. Anybody ever, while you were driving, anybody ever dropped a wheel off the pavement? And all of a sudden you wake up and you go, oh my gosh, what's that noise and that vibration? And you make a sudden impulsive turn to get back onto the pavement. Oftentimes that results in a rollover accident because the response to that stimulus was not appropriate. If we had left everything and just gone straight and brought the car to a stop, we'd have been much better off. But that sudden move at high speed can oftentimes lead to a wreck. That's that emotional bookmark running. So after we figure out there's a need for a decision, we decide to act, and our brain in the background goes through these emotional bookmarks, and it responds rapidly and unconsciously to that. And if the bookmarks are accurate, if the script is appropriate, then it's correct, and it just feels like we did the right thing. But if the response is not correct to the circumstances, or if the situation is different from what we're used to, we don't do very well. And if there's no bookmark at all for this, if this is a new situation, then we're really going to have to struggle to think about how to deal with it. So, what about the role of experience? I guess you can see that. Someone who's gotten away with doing the wrong thing more frequently than you have. Boy, there's some truth to that. So, this process of building new bookmarks goes on all the time. And when you think about experts, again, like Norman or GABA, they've got the experience and the knowledge, it just has to fit. GABA was completely comfortable in the river. He had done far more risky things as an Army Ranger, but his experience didn't fit the circumstances that he found himself in. So we have to be ready to review and to revise that mental script that's running. So, hard to see this, but that's a picture of a couple of guys up on a burned out mountain. And this was in the summer of 1994 near Grand Junction, Colorado. One of the guys is named Don Mackey, and he's leading a team of smoke jumpers fighting a fire, and he's on a ridge above the fire. And he had a sense that today this fire is not behaving like he's used to. And he had a lot of experience with fires. So he decides to take his 13 or 14 guys and lead them off to the side, off of the ridge and out of the way. Another fellow named Brian Schultz arrived and felt a pinprick of apprehension as was told in a book called Fire on the Mountain. He had seen the same situation. I got this backwards. Mackey took his team into the burned out area on the ridge, getting ready to fight the fire. Smoltz shows up with his team. He had seen something similar a few days earlier, and he said, this doesn't seem like I think it would be. It seems different somehow. So he trusted his gut, and he moved his team off the ridge and out of the way. And shortly thereafter, a 150-foot wall of flames came up that ridge, blowing up, trapped Mackey, and he and 13 others died that day on that fire. Smoltz and his team survived because he revised that mental model. Flight 587, November the 12th. It's an Airbus 300 with 260 passengers and crew. They are waiting and they take off from JFK. There had been a JAL 747 took off several minutes ahead of them. They're climbing out. The first officer is flying the airplane, and they encounter the wake turbulence. The pilot flying makes really aggressive control inputs with both the rudder and the aileron. This happened in the morning. Good weather, no particular problem with it, and yet he broke the airplane. And so when we look at it, the guy flying was a guy named Sten Mullen, 34 years old, lots of experience, 4,400 hours total, 1,800 hours in the airplane. But he had a history of aggressive rudder use. He was an Air Force pilot, and this had been noted in his training and his experience in the Air Force. He had done similar things before, and he seemed very concerned this morning about that JAL flight. And so they hit the first wake, and he does this wild overreaction, and the captain looks over at him and he says, "Hey, are you okay?" And he, in a strained voice, said, yeah, I'm okay. And then shortly thereafter, they hit the second wake, and he again goes through this wild gyration, and this time overstresses it until he breaks the vertical fin off the airplane, and the airplane crashes and kills everybody. So the NTSB looked at it, and they said the probable cause was the in-flight separation of the vertical fin as a result of loads beyond the design limit that were created by the unnecessary and excessive rudder travel pedal inputs. That's true, but was there more to the story? Well, it turns out that American Airlines, in order to get their crews to respond the way they wanted them to, the simulator didn't give them the response they were looking for, so they simply programmed it to be more sluggish. So the crews had to make a bigger input to get the same reaction out of it that they wanted. And so it gave them an exaggerated view of what it took to deal with a wake turbulence encounter. And the airplane they were flying was different again. The Airbus rudder system, although it met certification standards, is more sensitive than other transport category airplanes. So if you come up flying Boeings and now you move to the Airbus, suddenly they're not the same. And the travel limiter on the rudder is designed in a way that it becomes increasingly sensitive as the speed picks up. So you can see where this is going. Where in a low-speed encounter, he might have gotten away with it. As they were speeding up, it didn't work. And so it creates a control system change that pilots might not expect. And as most of us probably know, maneuvering speed, allows full control deflection in one axis. But when you combine axes together, there's all bets are off. May work, may not. So, in looking at the accident in light of what we've been talking about, the pilot's mental script did not match the situation, and the training he received didn't match the reality of the flight that day, and the design of the airplane never anticipated that somebody might do that. All right, so we're going to look a little bit now at how we mess up as pilots and as other people in these environments. First of all, we operate in a high-risk environment. Anybody that doesn't believe that isn't in touch with reality. It is a high-risk environment. And all of us have problems in our models and our scripts. I promise you. And some of us, Mr. Clinton, have poor impulse control. Just saying. And others, we have an assumption of excellence. We think we're better than sometimes we may be. And believe it or not, fear sometimes gets the best of us. And it doesn't just happen to pilots. It happens to climbers. It happens to motorcyclists. It happens to a whole bunch of people, surgeons in surgery. Lots of people who are operating in these environments can run into this kind of problem. So that's why in some of the ways that we fail. And believe it or not, technology is not always all that helpful. A friend of mine is getting a brand new panel put in his 182. And it's going to be really spiffy. But it comes with a real burden and a steep learning curve to be able to operate all the magic. And if we don't, it's really easy to get lost in the electrons. And then all of a sudden, things that seem like they ought to be simple turn out not to be so much. All right, so where are we going with all this? Well, let's look at how we succeed in this, knowing what we know. First of all is proper training. Absolutely critical. The reason the air carriers have such great accident records is because they train a lot. And they reduce these actions that are necessary to these unconscious mental scripts that run, and they are appropriate for the circumstances that they're in. But it takes regular practice. If you don't practice regularly, this is fragile knowledge, folks, and it gets away. And what was simple before, all of a sudden becomes much more difficult. And we have that curiosity factor is also part of this. We have to remain curious. We have to constantly be looking for things to learn. As Lawrence Gonzalez said, if you rehearse nonsense, you may find yourself one day being the victim of it. So it's appropriate that we train properly. And so keys to success. First of all, we have to be paying attention. If we're not engaged, if we're not paying attention, if we're in a vacation state of mind and something changes, we won't recognize it. And then when we're surprised by something happening, it's important to control emotions. And that's easy to say. But studies have shown that 90% of us, faced with an unexpected high-stress situation, won't do very well. They can't think very clearly in that environment. But we can learn to deal with it through this regular practice and appropriate training. We have to be able to think and analyze and plan in the face of all of that. And then once we know what we need to do, we need to act decisively for it. So you can see a little picture out the front of the Super Cub. Let me give you an example of how this can happen. Several years ago, I'm flying in Burnett with one of the folks from the local FAA office. They would come up quarterly and do training because they had to maintain their own proficiency in the event that they had to go ride with a tailwheel pilot. And I had a Super Cub, so this fellow showed up. Son, got to do my quarterly recurrent. I said, okay, great, Dave. And he said, oh, and by the way, they want me to do spins today. And I said, okay. I knew old Dave from having flown with him, and that little voice of intuition said, this is Dave. Maybe we ought to go up an extra 1,000 feet higher than where we normally did to do this. And so we climbed up a little higher, and I said, okay, Dave, you got the flight controls. When you're ready, let's go do a spin. Pulls the airplane up, powers off, pushes the left rudder, airplane brakes to the left, normal spin entry, and about the time the airplane gets about there, I see the throttle go wide open, which is not normal. Airplane makes about a 270-degree turn and ends up in an attitude about like that instead of like that. And we're in a spin, and we're turning, and we make about a turn and a half, and I see the controls go in to recover. Stick's in the middle, I feel the right rudder go to the floor, stick comes forward, and the airplane just keeps right on turning. It makes another turn. About the second turn over the intercom, very calmly, Dave says, okay, your controls. I go, whoa. I've never seen this before. I said, okay, my controls. So, I'm running through the litany, the rehearsal, the mental script, powers off, ailerons neutral, full opposite rudder, stick forward. Yep, everything's where it should be. Airplane makes another turn. It's not even beginning to come out of this. And I'm thinking, I can remember so clearly, what else is there? My brain is now in semi-panic mode, and I'm thinking, this isn't good. I've never seen anything like this. I got a sense we're going to keep doing this till we hit the ground, because nothing I'm trying is working. And so the thought went through my head, well, maybe there's something else I ought to try. Maybe there's something else. What else could there be? But I can remember how hard it was to think about what else there might be in the face of all of this going on. And I said, before I start getting creative, let me just make one more chance. Yeah, power's off, full opposite rudder, sticks in the middle, sticks forward. And I could move the stick just maybe another half inch, and I pushed it up against the back of the front seat, and the airplane kind of went and dropped its nose, and we came out of that at about 800 feet AGL. It wasn't anything I did, it just finally decided it wanted to come out of the spin. But the point is, it was real tempting to start doing something else other than the right thing because of the stress of that situation. We went on back, and that was the end of the flight for that day. So, one of the things that you have to think about in this is maybe we should not be so quick to judge when you're reading these accident reports and when you hear about somebody doing something which doesn't seem to make sense. There probably is more to the story. And another way to look at it, and this is a little bit philosophical, but I think it's something that needs to be said, we could avoid that by choosing to live a very quiet, boring life, couldn't we? And then we could die of cancer, right? So we can otherwise take the adventure. We try to minimize the risk for all these ways we've talked about, get the information we need, go forward, knowing we've done everything we could. But maybe we ought to be celebrating when people get it right. The Sullys of the world who got it right because of their training and because of that focus that it took to solve the problem they were in. And, another way to kind of wrap it up is that in a perfect adventure, it really isn't any more hazardous in real life, in ordinary life, because things happen, folks, particularly in the world of COVID, right? People, all of us now probably know somebody who's either suffered or died from COVID. So that thin rope that holds us here can always break. So that's what they were thinking. It's been my pleasure to be with you today, and we're going to have a question and answer session. Jeremy, you want to let them take a break before, in case people need the restroom?
All right, I'm going to ask the first question. What is the story with pursuing reinstatement for your examining authority?
Imagine that came up today. It's kind of like a friend of mine once said, who lives in Alabama. They were talking about some historical event that happened back in the mid-1800s, and this lady looked up, who was a multi-generational person from Alabama, and she said, "Oh, you mean the recent unpleasantness?" It's still current history in Alabama if you're talking about the Civil War, right? So in terms of again, I don't want to go through the whole thing chapter and verse, but to kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit, one of the questions I think comes up is, where are we with all of this stuff, with the DPE termination? And the short answer is, we're waiting to hear from the FAA. I was up at AirVenture. Brian and I were both there. And I got a friend of mine who is the executive director of the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators, who texted me and he said, are you at the show today? I said, yes, I am. He said, well, great, don't leave, we've got a meeting. I said, okay. So he had arranged a meeting with the FAA official who is the head of what's called AFS 600, which is the major department within FAA that manages a whole bunch of things, including all the designees. And he and I sat together for about 45 minutes or an hour and talked about what had happened. And my expressed concern to him was I was disappointed that nobody really looked at this, in my opinion, from an outside view. It was all done from people who had already decided what they were going to do. And I would like to have an sort of impartial review of this to see if what they did made sense. And he said, that's fair. And we talked through some of how that might happen, and he promised that he would have his people do that. That has been now since AirVenture, and we've gone back and forth with a couple of emails just staying in touch, the latest of which was a couple of days ago, and his email to me was they expect to have an opinion for me next week. Now, that could be that they would decide that what was done was justified and that's the end of the story. Or they could say, we think what was done was not justified and here's the path forward. Or it could be somewhere in between that. I have no idea. But what I am really, really encouraged about, far beyond what happened with my circumstance, and I'm not making light of that, but I just want you to understand that it's part of a bigger issue. And the bigger issue is that designees, whether they're pilots or mechanics, operate at the absolute discretion of the FAA. They have no guarantee of any kind of due process or fair treatment. They are required to acknowledge when they're coming around for their annual training that they understand they serve at the pleasure of the FAA and they can be terminated for no reason at all or any reason without explanation. And because so many people would like to do that job, that's the way the FAA chooses to operate. And that flies in the face of what the FAA is doing generally with pilots. Through the Pilot's Bill of Rights and through some other things that have happened, there has been truly a culture shift within the organization, within the agency. And they are much more committed to being responsive, to being transparent, to being fair with people, and they are doing that. But the DPE side of the house is sort of that last vestige of we can treat people however we want to because so many people want to do that, coupled with the fact that they've had some really bad DPEs. And so this official that I met with reinforced that they are absolutely committed to fixing that process, to making it fair and transparent and above board and using a collaborative approach with some people from industry as well as agency people to review similar circumstances for the next DPE who finds himself in that position. So that is the real important aspect of this. And I hope that, I hope we get some relief and I hope I get to go back and do it. I enjoy doing it. But I enjoy doing it because it is an opportunity to work with flight instruction providers to help them be better at the craft of preparing pilots. That's part of the major role, in my opinion, that a DPE has. And the problem with treating people unfairly is that it causes people, A, to not want to do that job, or B, if they are doing it, to be very careful about what they do for fear of raising a flag with somebody within the agency who just simply doesn't like what they're doing. So there are a lot of good things coming. I asked about timeline. To give you a little more background, right now, as you probably know, all the DPEs report to their local FSDOs, even though they can travel around the U.S. now to do testing. That is going to change. There is a move to bring the DPE reporting to a central part of the agency and take it out of the FSDOs. And that will be a very, very good thing when it happens. I asked what the timeline was. They seem to think about a year and a half to make that happen. So anyway, that's where that is. Any other questions about that? Yeah.
Well, mine's more of a statement. I just want to say thank you for continuing, not just walking away when they took that away from you, because I know Jeremy started a petition, right, to try to reach it. I'll tell you, me and a lot of people who are involved in the agency, I didn't sign that petition. Nothing against you.
No.
I don't want something going to FAA with my name on it.
Yeah.
Enough as it is. And that's the
I understand.
you're talking about. That's just we're the FAA. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One of the things that came out of this obviously traumatic experience for a number of us, and particularly for me and my family, was the outpouring of support from the aviation community. You know, when you're doing testing, inevitably you're giving people bad news sometimes, right? It's just part of it. But I always felt like that we had to try to be as kind with people as we could. We have to treat them properly, we have to treat them professionally. And so the biggest disappointment for me in this, among some others, was this was, without exception, an attack on professionalism and integrity. And that really was bothersome. But the thing that made it to where you could get by and deal with it was the outpouring of support through the petition that Marissa gathered and that many of you signed. And it just reinforced this idea that we are a community of pilots and we're in this together. And people recognize that this was not fair treatment. And so I'm very appreciative to this day of that outpouring of support. So thank all of you for that. Yes?
Does the FAA cap how many DPEs they can have? There seems to be a shortage.
Good question. There is no set number. They have to, two things have to happen. One, they have to have the need, which they do. And secondly, they have to have the ability to manage the number of people they have. So oftentimes the limitation is, who do they have within the FSDO office that can look after the management of a certain number of DPEs? And DPEs are specialists too. Some of them do helicopters or gliders or, things of that type. So it's a balance between those two things. But there is a shortage, and the shortage is worse now with COVID beginning to wane a little bit. The flight schools are busier, the airlines are hiring, and so the industry is complaining about the challenges of getting testing done. One of the responses to that, though, is you are seeing certain DPEs come into different areas, like particularly Phoenix and Florida, where there are a lot of flight schools, and in some cases the FAA is seeing DPEs do things that aren't correct. Too many tests a day, not treating people properly. There can be a bunch of problems. So it's not an easy problem, but they are ramping up. There are more DPEs coming.
Again, if I just may take a moment just to really
Sure.
kind of capture something, because a lot of people are not really aware of all of the things that has occurred behind the scenes in the last year or so. Just to caveat on what Jack said a moment ago about a concern of signing a petition. What has developed in this whole ordeal is there are now two active, I don't want to use the word fights, but two movements of change under the same umbrella. One, reinstatement for Ken and developing policy that will be both more fair and impartial, and also holding individuals within an office accountable and making them adhere to policy, not just what they feel like doing. On December the 2nd of last year, Trace Clinton, who is with us, and I went on the record and we released a video called Fired by the FAA, where we talked about the unfair treatment against Ken. And Trace and I equally went on the record, both on social media and on YouTube. As a matter of fact, Trace was actually more boisterous about the matter before I was. I sat back.
Imagine that.
What's that? What? So yeah, he was actually more boisterous. I sat back and I took more of a tactical aspect of this, tactful. I calculated methodically, and December 2nd we went on the record, and that's when we announced that we were going to be filing a petition. We exercised our First Amendment. We said we were going to file a petition, and it was not an attack on the FSDO or the FAA. It was we went on the record. I'm sure everyone in here watched the film. We didn't attack anybody individually, and I had no intention on attacking anybody individually. However, I got a phone call from my fast team program manager on December the 8th, and he says, Jeremy, I am being ordered to counsel you for your activities. I said, what activities? He says, I can't tell you. I said, does this have anything to do with the video release and the article that Isabel Goyer released? He says, I think so. I'm supposed to counsel you on your activities. I said, those activities are protected by the First Amendment, Ryan. He says, well, I have to counsel you. So Ryan gave me a counseling, told me that my participation in supporting Ken, or Pilots for Ken, which is the movement, could be viewed as negative. And I said, that's great counseling, Ryan. I really appreciate it. I said, I'm only here to try to effect positive change. And he said, well, is there anything else I can do for you? I said, yes, sir. Please provide this to me in writing. And he did. And so that escalated the situation to a degree where I've got a situation where I had to, take my action as necessary. And we've gotten some congressional folks involved and filed some complaints. And from what I understand, there have been a slew of complaints by many within the aviation community filed for various egregious actions. Now, again, I'm not trying to attack the FSDO or the FAA. The FAA has a very vital role and important mission, just like Ken has said. And not everybody in the FSDO is bad. I'm not attacking the FSDO as a whole, as an institution. But there are definitely some issues that have been identified in this process. Now, I just needed to get that out and communicate that Ken's got his ordeal, and I'm supporting him 100%, but I'm also trying to push back for positive change, and so that the FAA will move more towards their just culture policy, just like Ken was talking about. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Does the FAA try to influence whether DPEs will give check rides in experimental amateur-built aircraft or not?
No, they leave it to the discretion of the DPE. So, the DPE has to evaluate whether they're familiar enough with that airplane. And if so, then it's perfectly fine to do it. I've done a few in some experimentals. But it's more difficult because obviously not every DPE is going to have a broad experience in experimental aircraft. So it can be a challenge to find one.
Ken, what causes us to forget things on our checklist? I mean, what causes us to read over something on a checklist, say to ourselves that we've completed said action, I'm guilty of that, and forget to do it? What causes that?
I'm not sure, Jeremy.
Is it is it like we were talking about cognitive reading?
A lot of it is not paying attention. It becomes routine, and we just don't focus. That's probably the biggest issue. Sometimes it's lack of familiarity or complacency because we've done it and it always works. It can be a whole bunch of things.
So human factors and such, distractions can intervene. One of the things, and I'm not trying to steal your thunder or anything, but one of the things that I've noticed on that very topic is that if I'm ever distracted while I'm running a checklist, I may start back at a point where I left off, or I may not, and forget something. So what I found out due to some of the silly, embarrassing mistakes that I've made throughout my tenure as an aviator is I will just run the checklist from top to bottom. That's how I mitigate that. But, distractions and complacency.
True story. I was a young pilot flying out of a grass strip in Houston and had long rows of T-hangers. And I was up at the FBO and I was looking down the row of T-hangers and I saw a Cessna go taxiing by. And on the front of the nose wheel of the airplane, what was going bangity, bangity, bangity? The tow bar. He pulled the airplane out, got in it, and started taxiing, and everybody went running, stop! And fortunately, he stopped before it bounced up into the prop. So, stuff happens.
Any other questions?
I love the microphone. Brian Lloyd here. But in addressing Jeremy's point, I encounter this with students fairly regularly. And my approach is be deliberate. Oftentimes, I find myself getting in a hurry, speeding through the checklist, and crap, how did I forget to turn the boost pump on? You know, as I'm climbing out, and I go, wait, the switch is already off. So the point is, when you realize, especially when you realize you're in a hurry. Gosh, I was supposed to be airborne 10 minutes ago, and I'm going to be late arriving at Jeremy's thing, which happened to me this morning. That's when you have to go, okay, stop, think, slow down, be deliberate, and you won't have the problem.
Jeremy, why don't you talk about this, and then those that want to, we can let them go. We'll stay and answer questions as long as we want.
All right. Okay. We went ahead and opened up the doors, so it's not up on the screen.
Look here.
But I think we'll wrap it up, and we've got burgers burning out there. I know everybody's hungry. It's 11:30, and let's mingle and have a good time and visit. I would like, if you haven't gotten on my list over there, go ahead and fill out your name and your email address. It will get added to my database so that I can send out my updates. I want everybody to go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow me on Instagram at All American Aviation. And October the 12th at 7:30 p.m. Central, we will have aviation author and mechanic Mike Bush come back and join us at Breaking the Chain. So we got Mike Bush, and then we've got the weatherman J.P. Dice coming to join us late October. So for the most part, I want to appreciate everybody's participation today, taking your time to come up here and visit with us and see Ken present in person. And gosh, it's so great to get together with everybody in person again. So let's go ahead and chow down. Everybody, please give Ken a round of applause, please. One last question. Yeah, how many people flew? Oh, awesome. That's great. That's great. So probably about 30, 40% maybe? Excellent. All right, ladies and gentlemen. All right, ladies and gentlemen. God bless you. Thank you for coming out, and I look forward to seeing you guys again for more events like this in the future. Thank you.